Welcome everybody. Thank you for making yourself available on this Tuesday evening. We are very excited to have you here, and I'm very excited to introduce our guest speaker. Our speaker for tonight is Matthew Marwick. He is Deputy Headmaster at Marisburg College, and he's also subject head of history. Okay, so Matthew is going to talk to us about Red Harvest, the contribution of South Africa's traditional boys' schools to World War I. And Matthew will be looking at not just First World War rolls of honor of the leading so-called traditional boys' schools in South Africa, but offering his own views on related issues like the patriotic cultures at some of the schools before the war, the examples of heroic sacrifice set during the war by the great public schools in Britain like Eton and Harrow, the role of patriotic schoolmasters in fostering such an ethos, and the considerable importance at those schools at the time of such old-fashioned concepts such as courage, honor, and duty. His talk does offer anecdotes about the notable schools in KwaZulu-Natal, such as Marisburg College, Durban High School, Hilton College, Michael House, and Glenwood High, but also about the more far-flung places like Sid Andrews College and King Edward VII. Matthew, thank you for making time for us tonight. We are very excited to have you here, okay? And we are looking forward to your talk. You must just unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Alta. I'm very excited and very honored to be here. Shall I just try and call up my PowerPoint? Is that
perfect?
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, Alta, shall I get going then?
You can start. Thank you, Matthew.
Okay. Alta, thank you very much for your warm welcome. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. I'm just a humble history teacher and coach of a 9th team rugby. I'm certainly not an intellectual or a wit, but I've got, it's a great honor for me to share with you an interest that I've developed over the last 10 or so years. It's quite interesting. I live in a part of South Africa where one of the first questions you're ever asked, and I don't know if it's the same where you live, but the question is asked, what school did you go to? There's a number of very fine schools around here in KZN. And it certainly is something that I've carried with me since I was a schoolboy here in Marisburg myself. I've been a teacher at my old school since July of 2004. And when I arrived, I lived in this old building, which was built in 1888. And I lived on the far right-hand side. That bay window was part of my dining room. And I was very happy to live in this old building and of course, breathe in this old air. I'm a history teacher after all. And if you've got any questions, please jump in at any time. So while I was getting used to living in this old building, this was the view that I would look out to every day. Now, you know, I'm an old boy of the school. I know its history well. And I knew that this was the First World War memorial. But of course, living there every day and looking out onto this war memorial every day, I began to pay a little bit more attention. And on the left-hand side is the unveiling of that war memorial in 1923. It's very much a colonial site. It's the Union Jack flag, and on that flag are the words Loyal Natal, and we see the cadets have been lined up in honor of the unveiling. And on that memorial, there are 100 names. There are 97 schoolboys and 3 masters. And as time passed, I began to learn a little bit more about these 100 names. Now, at the same time, I also gained a lot of inspiration from this gentleman. This chap's name is Robert Clark, and he is known as the father of Marisburg College. He was an Oxford man. He was a first-class scholar. He was a great classicist. He was a tiny little man, but very witty and funny and warm. And as a young teacher, and I'd done Latin at university, I gained a lot of inspiration from this old man, the father of my school. The photo on the far right-hand side is a sad photo because it was the last photo ever taken of Robert Clark, who I learned had died of a broken heart. And interestingly enough, as I look at the time, he died on the evening of the 28th of May, 1917, so 104 years ago. Once again, I dug a little bit deeper, and I noticed that on that First World War memorial that I admired every day, amongst those 100 names was this little section. And there we have a photo that I took, and there's the name of DSD Clark. And I learned that that was Robert Clark's only son, Douglas Scott Dalrymple Clark. And there's a picture of young Douglas Clark as a cadet in the Marisburg College Cadets in the 1890s. And Douglas Clark had joined the British Army. He had apparently got quite posh. He had double-barreled his name. The D there in his name stands for Dalrymple. It was his mother's maiden name. And he double-barreled his name so that he became Captain Dalrymple Clark, a lot more grander. And he joined one of the fancy regiments in the British Army, and he was commissioned, and he rose to be a captain. And I learned that he had earned a military cross in August of 1916, but sadly in September had been killed by shrapnel fire at the Somme. So in September of 1916, he died. So it wasn't a great surprise then that his father had died of a broken heart about 9 months later. He never recovered from the death of his beloved child. So I began to pay a lot more attention to what was going on that memorial, and it became quite an inspiration for me. So I used to wonder, well, if we've got 100 names, well, what about the other so-called traditional boys' schools? So over the last 15 years, I've built up quite a collection. This is a very small part of them, of the history books of, I think, all the great boys' schools in South Africa that I can get a copy of. I'm still looking for a Paul Roos one. I think that's going to be very expensive. I recently got the Boy and You from Sid Andrews, which is quite magnificent. So as time passed, I built up a database based on my research into these old schools. So what I'm about to share with you, I share with a lot of humility. It might come across as quite crass, the manner in which I'm sharing it based on numbers. They are quite inhumane almost, but I'd like to say I'll offer them with great respect. And I'm reminded of the words written in a letter to a newspaper in 1915 by this great headmaster, Sir Frank Fletcher, who by that time was a headmaster of Charterhouse, one of the great schools in England. This newspaper had said in 1915, 1 year into the war, that they wanted to publish the details of all the old boys who had died and have a running tally of the school that had the most deaths and the most medals. And not surprisingly, Sir Frank had been horrified. And there are his words. He wrote, lists of this kind seem to suggest competition and comparisons inappropriate to a matter in which all schools are loyally doing their utmost. And I've certainly taken on board Sir Frank Fletcher's warning from 106 years ago. This is not a hit parade of names and deaths and tallies and medals. So let's have a look at the South Africans who died in World War I. Of course, they were overwhelmingly white. The figure that I quoted is from an article that appeared about 15 years ago that said that precisely 8,551 white South Africans were killed. Now, of that number, a sizable minority of 1,300 were killed at, they came from only 17 schools. So I often at this stage in a talk then invite the listeners to guess which school provided the most casualties. Would anyone like to take a guess?
St Andrews.
Yeah, that's a great guess. And that
Grey
is,
College.
it's not Grey. And
Bishops.
Bishops, you're all very close. I'm going to my next slide. Not surprisingly, it is the oldest school in South Africa. It's Sachs, founded in 1829. And here is the war memorial of Sachs at the school. And it's got 164 names on its memorial. A key thing here, ladies and gentlemen, you've pointed out St Andrews, you've mentioned Grey College, which I'll get to shortly. A key factor here is the size of a school during the crucial years of about 1908 to 1912. So Sachs, being a big all-boys school in Cape Town, no doubt it was sizable, and it would have had a strong martial tradition. And these young men of schools like Sachs were ideal cannon fodder for the great battles on the Western Front. St Andrews was mentioned. Now, St Andrews has got a terrific martial history, which I'll touch on just now. It's down in Makanda. It had 127 old boys killed in World War I. And the famous diocesan college bishops had 113 killed. And of those, interestingly, 4 were rugby internationals. And then the contribution beyond its roll of honor of Bishop's Boys is quite outstanding, because its old boys earned 190 decorations in World War I. And I did read in a academic paper that the school received the thanks of the House of Commons at the end of World War I. Going through the schools with more than 100 or thereabouts, 100 from Marisburg College, Dale College down in King Williamstown, another great frontier school, gave out 93 of its boys. And then our great rival school, the Durban High School in DHS, gave up 86. And here we have the other schools who, as far as I know, gave up 50 or more of their boys: Queens, King Edward's. And I'm going to single out Kes, because Kes had only been founded 12 years before war broke out. But once again, I'll get to the fact that Kes probably had a sizable intake of boys around 1908, 1909, 1912, so that when war broke out and when those great battles of 1916 and 17 were fought, its boys were of a certain age. Interestingly, Grey College does not feature. Grey has got a terrific martial history. It's given up a number of generals and notable military men. But I've contacted Grey on a number of occasions, and the archivist the first time just said we haven't put together a roll of honor for World War I. I do think, and it's a fair point, I do think that the injuries and the hurt of the Boer War, which had only finished 12 years earlier, still rested with many of those old Greys. So they probably didn't flock to the colors to fight for king and country like the English-speaking schools, and much the same for Paul Roos, Paul Gim, and Paul Boys High down in the Western Cape. I think we get to $1 million question here, and that is, why would these boys go and fight for king and country? Why would they be prepared to give up their lives for a distant king and throw their lives against the German machine guns? And I turn to the words of this rather fire-eating headmaster from St Andrews. You can see he was there for a long time, who described schools like St Andrews as being munition factories, turning out a constant supply of living material. So, you know, it was very much a duty for these young men to go off and fight for the motherland back in England. And he has another quote from Reverend Kettlewell: loyalty, duty to the crown, daring, a sense of adventure and other motives, but of these duty was sacrosanct. That's him summarizing the views of boys of St Andrews and schools like him. It's a very Edwardian sort of notion. Closer to home here in KZN, my class, which is another great school, it was a new school by 1914. And here's an extract of its school magazine of later of 1914. And I'll just read it. You can read it yourself. This war is emphatically our war. We may well be proud of the high privilege of being called upon to play our part in the struggle. We look with confidence to those who have spent their boyhood at Makelaos, to give their manhood in their country's behalf, without bluster, without flag wagging, but with cool heads, quiet tongues, and hearts and nerves of steel. So it's quite a poignant description of the way in which these young boys at these schools look to their duty to go and fight for a distant king from England and to defend the empire. It's fairly naive, I think we would say, as we look back, knowing what happened at the Battle of the Somme and those other terrible battles that were still to come. Another example is bishops, and here's a very splendid example of the kind of man that taught at bishops, and no doubt the kind of boy that bishops produced. This was Canon Oxo Bull, named after the famous gravy. And it's also worth noting that the school motto at bishops is pro fide et patria, so for faith and for country. And here's this wonderful description of this very colorful canon churchman / military man. Canon Bull, whose nickname was Oxo, was a vigorous man, a man of the church and a soldier who wore army boots under his cassock. It was said of him that he could form a procession of one as he marched down the aisle of the chapel. And as you will see, he earned an MC in World War I and came back to fight again despite being way beyond normal age in World War II. So that was the kind of man that was teaching at bishops at the outbreak of World War I. And here we have a heavenly tribute to the fallen, to the dead of bishops. This magnificent picture of the knight with St. George, so the St. George defending, and the 113 names of bishops' boys given up in World War I. But what an incredible sight. It's very sort of a heavenly, heroic sight. I'd just like to return to Sid Andrews as well. As far as my research goes, Sid Andrews has given up the most boys in all wars. They had a lot of old boys die in the Boer War and in World War II, as did bishops, but more at St. Andrews. So this incredible statistic that by the end of the Second World War, about 1 in 11 Andreans had died in battle. So an incredible sacrifice. And I'd like to bring you to this letter written by this young St. Andrews boy at the start of World War I to his mum. He's Harold Broster, and he writes, "If I have to go to the front, it will be quite an honor, fighting for my God, King, you, and St. Andrews." And that notion of fighting for your king, defending your family, but yes, defending the old school, I think is very typical of many boys of this time. And it's a very tragic story, but Harold was shot on the battlefield. He was carried off by his brother, who became an esteemed knight of the realm, and he died on St. Andrew's birthday, the 30th of November, 1917. So what a tragic tale for this young Andrean. Now back home in Marisburg, I always gained inspiration from Mr. Clark. So here we have him on the left, but sitting next to him is a very inspiring figure. His name is Aubrey Samuel Madevo Langley. And Madevo is the Zulu word for a moustache. And Mr. Langley had a wonderful moustache, somewhat of a flavor saver, which earned him this Zulu nickname. But he was a man of brooding ferocity. And he had extremely ferocious views on courage, on manliness, on rugby, and on the pursuit of the noble manly ideal. So he was here for quite a long time, and then he went off to DHS, Durban High, and he was their great headmaster in World War I. And he had a running war with Glenwood High, which was the technical school in Durban. And he would shout at boys at his school if they were poorly dressed. And he would say things like, "The tech is the place for swine like you, And if you played soccer, you were known as a soccerite thug. So we'll get back to Madevu again, but he casts a huge shadow over the schooling of young boys in old colonial Natal. Now, where does this all come from? Why would these boys in Natal, the Free State, Johannesburg, and in the Cape join and fight? And it's a very British thing, and it's got a tremendous British heritage, exemplified none better than the sacrifices made by Etonians in World War I. Now, as you can see, there are over 1,000 Etonians died in World War I. And if you go to that school, it's an incredible school to go to. All its old boys, and there are thousands of them who have died in wars, are on tablets around its cloisters. And you will see that about 21% of all its boys who volunteered in World War I died. And that's ignoring the boys who were gassed, who were wounded, who were captured. It's an incredible sacrifice by one school. And when I was there, I was looking at these names, and I came across just this one family. I've heard of Smith Dorian. I've never heard of Dorian Smith. And there are 5 of these blokes, all in one family, all killed in World War I. Quite incredible. This is, of course, the school of Boris Johnson and David Cameron and the Royal Princes. It's given up 20 prime ministers of the United Kingdom. Interestingly, and I don't want to dwell on Eaton, there's its board of Victoria Crosses. It's given up 37 VCs. 14 were won in World War I. I'll bring your attention, as South African people no doubt interested in our wars. There's a young Lieutenant Frederick Slay Roberts, later Field Marshal Roberts, top right. Over here in the middle panel, there's his son, Freddie Roberts, who was killed in Colenso, saving the guns in 1900 in the Boer War. You will also see the name of Colonel Buller, who won his VC in the Zulu War. He, of course, became General Buller in the Boer War. And I also highlighted Colonel H. Jones. Some of you may follow the Falklands War. He led a charge of the machine gun as a colonel in the paratroopers. So an incredible martial tradition. But just to summarize other schools from Britain, 733 boys from Marlborough. That's the school that gave us the Duchess of Cambridge. 707 from Wellington, 687 from Charterhouse. And there you can go through them. I single out Harrow at the bottom, 22%, nearly 1 in 4 of its boys killed in World War I. Let's have a look elsewhere in the empire. St. Andrews once mistakenly stated that they believed they had the most boys killed in World War I. We can see that they were mistaken, but it's interesting to see the sacrifice here of the Sydney Grammar School, 302 boys from that Australian school, and there's some other schools from Australia and New Zealand. Big Auckland Grammar School, probably the most prominent school in New Zealand. And for the rugby fans, Otago Boys High is where Richie McCaw went to school. Here's another example from Upper Canada College in Toronto. It's known as the Eaton of Canada, and 176 boys died there. And it's interesting to know how old boys often embellish their school's records. I remember having a beer with a Michaelhouse old boy, and we were chatting away. He didn't know that this was one of my great interests. And he loosely said to me, oh, well, 150 old boys of Michaelhouse died at the Battle of Delva Wood. And of course, he was very mistaken. I didn't correct him. I left him at that. And I've mentioned to you the example of St. Andrews. I've mentioned to you the high number of deaths at British schools. So about 1 in 9 British soldiers died, about 11% of all Tommies who volunteered. In the South African Army, it was about 1 in 12, if you look at all the recruitment figures. And looking at these old boys' schools, you can see at Wynberg and Grey, high down in PE, it was about 1 in 12, King Edward's 1 in 11. It's interesting, Kes was a young school, but clearly it had those big numbers already. Rondebosch, 1 in 10, Jeppe, 1 in 9, Marisburg College, 1 in 8, You get to Durban High School about 1 in 6. That's excluding boys captured, POW'd, gassed, etc. And I single out once again these 2 schools at the end, 2 great private schools of South Africa, Michael House and St. John's. And there they began to match the numbers of the British schools, the proportions. So 46 Michaelhousians were killed and only 198 enlisted. So that's a very high percentage. And at St. John's College in Joburg, 60 old boys died out of 299. Once again, a very high percentage of old boys who were sadly killed. Another interesting statistic is that in the entire British Empire, only 1 headmaster of a private school, of course they call them public schools there, let's not even go there, but of all those great schools in the entire British Empire, only 1 headmaster was killed in action, and that was the headmaster of Michael House. He was a young headmaster. He was only 29 when he was appointed. He got special permission to go and fight, and he was killed by a sniper fire at the Somme in August of 1916, a month before Douglas Clark was killed by shrapnel. Speaking of headmasters, well, what of other headmasters from these schools? A number of them had what was called a good war. You were highly regarded after World War I and World War II if you could say that you had a good war. One of the men was Obas Gain of Kingswood. He was a colonel in the Middlesex Regiment of the British Army, and he was described as being every inch a military man. Now, I can imagine he ruled his school with a rod of iron. Another military man was Arthur Martin. He came to Marisburg College. He earned a military cross, and here we see him standing in the rugby photo at the back there. He was a bit young. In the white suit is Madevu Langley, my old hero with the moustache. But anyway, Betsy ended up being the officer commanding the Durban Light Infantry. Another man who had a really good war was Ronald Curry. He had an MC in bar. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He'd gone to St. Andrews in Grahamstown. He joined the Black Watch, that great regiment in Scotland, and he had earned these 2 gallantry awards. He ended up being the headmaster or rector of Michael House and the headmaster of his old school. But we have to bow our heads, doff our caps to 2 headmasters of St. John's. Lieutenant Colonel Father Charles Runge earned 3 gallantry awards. That's an incredible amount for one man. He earned a DSO and an MC and a bar. But even Colonel Runge has to doff his hat to his predecessor, and that was Father Eustace Hill. Now, Father Hill had only won, I say only with respect, a military cross. But they say at the Battle of Delva Wood, as he ran backwards and forwards, giving succor and providing assistance to dying South African soldiers, he actually earned a VC many times over. Just no one survived to tell the tale. A couple of months later, his arm was blown off. He earned a military cross, and in 1918, he was captured as a prisoner of war. So he suffered incredibly, and he was an incredible example to boys from his school in the 1920s. I'd like to have a look at a couple of group photos, if I may. I've referred to Eaton. Eaton, the example there is incredible. There's their famous 1912 cricket team, and 5 of that cricket side died. They fought on 7 fronts. 1 guy was captured, 1 guy was gassed, 4 others were injured. So there's incredible suffering at those English schools. But it's not just the fashionable posh schools. Here we have the Glasgow Academy old boys in the Scottish Rifles. There are 11 men in this photo, all from one school. And amazingly, 8 of those men were to die on one day in Gallipoli on the 28th of June, 1915. I mean, that's an incredible and most poignant statistic, 8 in one day. Here's a newspaper cutting from the old Natal Witness of December of 1916. The Battle of the Somme started on the 1st of July. So this photo was taken probably in late June, and in it we have 18 old boys of Marisburg College. They're posing in the woods of France before they go and fight on the Somme. And by the end of the war, 8 of them had died. The majority of those 8 had died already by the time this picture appeared in the Natal Witness in December of 1916. So once again, a very poignant reminder of the suffering of these young boys. Here's a picture of Durban High School rugby team. It's regarded as the greatest rugby team of the early 20th century. I think it was unbeaten. All of these 15 boys in this team joined up, and 4 of them were killed, 4 out of 15. That's a remarkable degree of suffering. Let's move on to Delva Wood, which was fought in the middle of July of 1916 as part of the Battle of the Somme. And there we have the number of old boys from these schools who died in that one battle. So it was fought over about 6 days, 12 DHS boys, 11 from Marisburg College. So a lot of boys from Natal, old Natal, joined up. And then we have Sid Andrews, St. Patrick's CBC from Kimberley Boys High, and then Wynberg, Michael St. John's, and Bishops. So have a look at those 15 boys from Wynberg. So 15 were in the battle, 7 were killed, and 4 were wounded. Only 4 were unscathed. Of the boys who were from St. John's, 12 go into battle, 5 were killed, and 5 were wounded, 2 unscathed. Some remarkable figures there. I'm also going to single out another great rival school of mine, of ours here in Marisburg, and that's Glenwood. Now, Glenwood had only been founded 4 years before the war, but it's a day school in Durban. It would have got some numbers. 15 of its old boys fought at Delva Wood, and 4 died. And this is an amazing stat for me. Of those 11 survivors, 7 were to die between October and 16 and March of 1918. That's an incredible attrition rate. And of those boys, this is a terrible stat. 1 had earned a military medal. He was a brave boy, and he died, and he hadn't even turned 17 yet. You know, I've got 2 young boys, and I teach young men. That just chills my heart. 4 Victoria Crosses were earned by old boys of these traditional schools. Here is the former head boy of St. John's, Oswald Reed, who won his in Mesopotamia. He'd been a great hero at St. John's and at Wet Pups, the preparatory school in the Cape. This wonderful fellow had been to Dale, Queens, and St. Andrews. He was known as Jack Sherwood Kelly, and he has the famous distinction of having been expelled from all 3 of those schools. But he was known as the bravest man in the British Army, so a very proud product of all of those schools. Just up the road from me, another very brave man. So Reginald Hayward, he's a farm boy from Natal. I beg your pardon. He had already won a military cross and a bar. So an MC, a bar, and a Victoria Cross, 3 gallantry awards. This is an incredibly brave man. And he displayed almost superhuman powers of endurance, having been buried, wounded in the head, and rendered deaf on the first day of operations, and had his arm shattered 2 days later, and he fought on. This man has every claim to be the most decorated from a gallantry point of view of any South African of World War I, and his name is Andrew Beecham Proctor. He was a little man, a diminutive fellow. He was a famous balloon buster for the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force. He was educated at St. George's and Sachs, so 2 of the oldest schools in the country. And he ended up with a DSO, an MCM bar, a DFC, and a Victoria Cross. So 5 gallantry awards. And there's a very famous story of this little guy with this huge chest full of medals, with his youthful complexion, being stopped by a policeman and being accused of being an imposter. And he had to explain, excuse me, I am Lieutenant Beecham Proctor, DSO, MC and bar, DFC, Victoria Cross. And I think he got a lot of respect after that. I'd also like to just single out 3 blokes that I came across in my studies of these schools. One is the on-field battlefield commander on days 1 and 2 of Delva Wood. And this is Colonel William Tanner. He later became a brigadier general. He had been at Marisburg College, and then I suppose you could say he saw the light and he went up to Hilton College. But although he didn't have many gallantry awards, he was arguably the most highly decorated South African soldier of World War I. So you can see his medals there. He was mentioned in dispatches 6 times, and there are his medals on display at the War Museum in Saxonwold. What you might be interested to know is that William Tanner, who displayed great bravery and was an extremely fine soldier, was described in the admission book at Marisburg College all the way back in 1877 as being dull but amiable. So I hope that gives a little bit of hope to all of us. You don't have to be a superstar at school. This is another wonderfully colorful young man. He left King Edward VII School, Kes, as a teenager. He had been a great hero of the school. Within a very short period of time, he was still a youthful teenager. He shot down the famous fighter pilot of the German Air Force, Oberleutnant Max Immelmann, who's wearing the blue max of the Paula Merite. And for shooting down the legendary Max Immelmann, he was awarded a DSO as a teenager, a very brave young teenager. And then a young man from their rival school at Jeppe up in Joburg, Flight Lieutenant Samuel Kincaid, he also had 5 gallantry awards. What a man he must have been. He earned a DSO, a DSC and bar, and a DFC and bar, but one of his gallantry awards was earned after the First World War, and he died in a flying accident. But what an incredibly brave man he was, and there's the book about his life. So Kincaid. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm beginning to finish off here. You've been great. Thank you very much. I hope you're still hanging in there. This is my second to last slide. I find it very fascinating that as these young boys got closer and closer to the battlefield, so many of them began to more and more have thoughts of their school. And without a doubt, they latched on to the happy and sort of poignant, carefree times of their school days, perhaps as comfort and perhaps as inspiration. I love this little story that I found of this old boy of Selborne who wrote to his mother, and he wrote there, "Very glad to hear that Selborne beat Dale at tennis, and sorry to hear that we got the usual licking at rugby. I do miss the good old school and the sports." And how many of these old boys would have taken that same comfort of hearing stories from their old school? I'd like to single out Eton again. There was a Prime Minister of England called the Earl of Rosebery, and when he died in his 80s, he was a very proud old Etonian. As he was dying, drifting off into the afterlife, he had given an instruction to his valet to play over the gramophone the Eton boating song, which is the Eton song, which talks about lovely boating weather. It's a really cheerful song. And clearly it was the Earl of Rosebery's desire to take comfort and inspiration from his old school as he died. And those sentiments were very much echoed at the Second Battle of Arras in France in April of 1917. Now, the household cavalry, those grand regiments of the cavalry of the British Army, their young officers were overwhelmingly Etonians. And as the whistle went, and these young officers emerged from the trenches to go over the top into no man's land, and many of them going to their deaths. The Eton history describes how the Eton boating song could be heard echoing over no man's land as these young boys, these young officers, sang their school song, and no doubt with highly polished shoes, boots, and swords, and walking sticks, went to face the German machine guns. I've got an example there of Logie Legat, but I think I've spoken enough about Eton. This is my second to last slide. I've mentioned Madevu Langley on a number of occasions. He really was a fire-eating, terrifying headmaster. He loved the cane. He had a droopy eyelid that schoolboy legend had it that he had got fighting in the Bambata rebellion. That's probably a lie. He probably got it because he was a huge drinker of whiskey. So he was a very scary guy. He loved the cane. But in his wartime addresses at Durban High School, famously, he used to weep as he read the ever-lengthening roll of those DHS boys who had died in World War I in the trenches. And it is said that he used to tell those boys in assembly how his DHS old boys had gone over the trenches into no man's land, shouting, "School, school, 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 school," which I must say, I take as a master at one of these old schools is a wonderful inspiration to these young boys. Ladies and gentlemen, but we can't get all glum here, thinking about Madevu Langley and his tears. So it's important that we end on a good note. So this is my final slide. And 5 years ago, in July of 2016, I took a party of 30 boys from Marisburg College and 10 adults. And we went to the centenary of the Battle of Delva Wood. And not only did we have a wonderful and memorable time at that parade, but we went to a number of graves. And one of the graves that we did find was the grave of Douglas Scott Dalrymple Clark, pictured there on the left. And we had the most incredible little ceremony around his grave. We recited some Latin in honor of his father. There was poetry, there was a song, there was a war cry. And I had smuggled some soil that I had taken from the garden of his old house, Clark House, where he played as a young boy. I'd put it in a packet, a little packet in my shoes, and I'd gone through French customs. So I had it with me. So we sprinkled this bit of soil on his grave in France. And maybe the final bit to give it a full circle is that I then, of course, took some soil from his grave, stuck it in that self-same now empty packet, and stuck it in my boot and brought it back to South Africa and sprinkled it here in our garden of remembrance. So there's my way of remembering Douglas, of honoring these men who died in their thousands in the war, and yeah, hopefully to end on a reasonably upbeat note despite a fairly grueling subject matter. So thank you very much for staying with me till the end. If there's anyone who's got any questions.
Any questions?
May I ask something?
Yeah,
What is a balloon buster?
If I'm not mistaken, it's there were Zeppelins over London that were massively destructive. So these large airships would fly over London at very high altitude, and they would drop bombs, and they would cause huge terror in especially London. So these pilots of the Royal Flying Corps would be sent up in their very rudimentary planes, and they would then go and shoot these Zeppelins, and they would have these aerial duels over the skies of London. I stand corrected if they really are balloons, but I presume they're nicknames for the Zeppelins.
Thank you. Yes, we'll definitely have a look, and I'll Google that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Matthew, thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderfully interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that there's some lovely comments, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you. Very nice.
Much obliged.
It was excellent. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Matthew, I've got a question before you go. Did you find this information in the yearbooks?
No, so I've got those history books of all those schools, and I've got maybe 30 of these books. But I do have yearbooks for some of the schools, you know, St. Andrews, the 1918 one. I know that every year it's tragic. You look at the yearbook for 1916 and you'll see 20, 30 boys have been killed. So they were helpful where I had them, but I relied on the main on these history books.
Okay.
Yeah.
Matthew, if I could just come in, it's Alan Montgomery, Port Elizabeth. I'd just like to observe something. Some of those pilots that shot down X amount of opposition, it was all in 1916. According to my records, the war started in August 14, and they still had to be trained. They certainly weren't trained here in South Africa. So they went overseas on a 3-month voyage and arrived in England, not knowing what an aeroplane basically was, and became masters of the craft within a year, which is pretty good.
Yeah, Alan, I can see you know more about this than I do, but you're absolutely right. And many of the great fighter aces, including the great Red Baron Manfred von Richthofen, they started off in the infantry. I'm an old infantry lance corporal, so you know the grunts of the army. And yes, they gravitated towards the skies and learned their skills very quickly, because it really was a matter of kill or be killed. And you know, there's the famous Blackadder sketch where he refers to the 20 minuters. The average life expectancy of a young pilot was 20 minutes in the air. You know, maybe that's an exaggeration, but it highlighted the incredible danger, not just of being shot by a German, or if you're a German, shot by one of your counterparts, but of engine failure. These planes were very, very dangerous. And you know, the number of wasted lives in just air crashes is very tragic as well.
Matthew, hi.
Thank you.
John, you've got a question?
Thanks. Thank you, Alta. Matthew, hi. John Webb here from Bloemfontein. I matriculated in the 60s at a very small school, which probably wouldn't be within your compass. I don't know, St. Aidan's College in Grahamstown.
Yes.
The catch with St. Aidan's is that I think it was, well, when I was there, it was 100% a boarding school. So, in other words, the guys, you couldn't track them down as Grahamstowners who joined up. They would have been, I mean, when I was at college, we had chaps from northern, well, the old northern Rhodesia, if I could call it that, southwest. There were Italians, there were obviously guys from the Cape, there were Transvaalers. So I don't know, has St. Aidan's come under my radar a little bit, because I'm not a boffin, but I'm quite keen on Boer War stuff. And I saw that the St. Aidan's cadets were called up in the Boer War, I think it was 1900. Apparently, one of the Boer generals was threatening Grahamstown. I'm not sure it wasn't Kritzinger, but whatever. And the cadets from St. Andrews, Kingswood, and St. Aidan's joined up. And what was interesting then, because it goes back, it's outside the purview of your talk, but it's quite interesting. Apparently, Grahamstown had the largest contingent of cadets in the British Empire outside of London, which I found quite interesting. But I don't know whether would they have featured, I mean, I'm sure St. Aidan's always would have featured in the First World War, but being so spread, that would make things difficult to track down, I take it.
Yeah, quite possibly. I do have the history of St. Aidan's here. It's amongst my collection. So I would guess that they most certainly would have given boys to go and fight and to die, of course. They probably didn't get 50. That was kind of my cutoff. But I've got them on a very extensive table that I've drawn up. I mean, I can send you those details, John. And you're also quite right about the Boer War. Grahamstown was threatened by, they were referred to as rebels, but sort of rampaging Boer forces. And I know St. Andrews had a very prominent role, so I'm not surprised to hear that. And of the great sacrifices of Grahamstown. It's a very much a little embryo of the British Empire, I think, in its day.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Maybe I'll get your email from somebody and drop you a note about the St. Aidan's stuff. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Any other questions for Matthew? Then I just want to say thank you very much, Matthew. It was very nice to listen to this talk. Okay, it is very sad to see so many young guys passing away in the war and fighting for king and country. It sort of like breaks your heart if your own children are also that age.
Also, thank you very much, and it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you for everybody for sitting in. We've got people from all over the country and the UK. It is a wonderful audience. Thank you so much.
Just from my side, if I see this statistics before I go to the army, I had definitely not become a major in the army. I had run away before that.
Ja, Hendrik.
Verseker, Hendrik.
Okay, almal, dankie. Ek gaan Kobai sê en afsluit, né? Thank you,
Bye, Alta,
Matthew.
dankie.
Dankie, tada. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.